So welcome everyone. We're really pleased to welcome you to the Conversations in Canadian Bioethics series. This series is hosted by the Canadian Bioethics Society and is generously sponsored by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. So a warm welcome to our CBS members, supporting organizations, as well as those of you who are not yet members. There are a few ways you can join our conversation today. We're very pleased to have live simultaneous interpretation available for this session. Please select the language from the interpretations icon at the bottom of your screen. You can choose French and English. You may enter a question at any time using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and you may enter your question in either French or English. Your name may be mentioned alongside your question. If you do not wish to have your name be mentioned, please select the option to have your question anonymous. You can also share your thoughts about this session and suggested topics for future sessions by filling out our survey, which we will much encourage you to do with the link that will be posted later on. And of course, this full session is being recorded and will be available on our website, www.bioethics.ca. And of course, we wanted to give a land acknowledgement. So to further the goals of truth and reconciliation, I would like to acknowledge and recognize the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Silk Nation, which is where I live in Kelowna, British Columbia. But I encourage all of you to take a moment to acknowledge the land that you're on and the Indigenous peoples, First Nations, including the Métis, the Inuit, and other ancestors who have lived on and honored this land for centuries. And by recognizing this history, we acknowledge how our country was settled, and in the spirit of reconciliation, commit to addressing the injustices of the past and the systemic racism and oppression that continues today. So a little bit about this forum. So it's the CBS-SCB is an interdisciplinary and interprofessional forum to discuss important topics in bioethics in Canada. I'm your host today. My name is Zach Walbaum. I am the Treasurer and Finance Officer on the CBS board. And so the CBS launched the conversation series last spring to bring opportunities for dialogue throughout the year outside of our annual conference, and also to engage members or individuals who are not yet members from diverse disciplines and backgrounds to enrich our conversations. We have two upcoming episodes, which you'll see, which is June and September. And you can of course, sign up for these, and we encourage you to sign up for these. And if this is the first time you're hearing about the CBS and you'd like to continue to be a part of these conversations, you can always come and join our organization. You can attend our annual business meeting if you do sign up, which is coming next month. And we do have both individual and institutional members, and support from all our members allows us to continue to exist as a registered charity and nonprofit society. So one thing that we wanted to do in this series is to thank our supporting organization for their ongoing support, and the supporting organization that we're highlighting at the beginning of our session today is the Memorial University Center for Bioethics, and which I will turn that to Dr. Jennifer Flynn.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Or Zach, I can only see your face, so can you tell me if people can hear me? If you can hear me? Can you?
I can hear you. Okay. It's great.
So can you go to the next slide? So yeah, I was told that I had 3 or 4 minutes to present some highlights of our center. So I have 4 points I'm going to make. So here we have 2 of them. So I'll start with just a general description of what's going on with us. So we developed the idea of a center around 2014, 2015, and officially became a center in 2018. And we wanted to become a center mainly because we felt that we lacked visibility nationally and internationally, yet we're doing all of the things that most centers do, sort of as a collective and as individuals. And this has worked fairly well, despite the fact that COVID sort of interrupted our initial launching. We have 4 core faculty members. 3 of us are philosophers. And 1 of us is an anthropologist. And our appointments are, generally speaking, university professorships. So we have the research service and teaching components to our jobs. But the unusual thing about our jobs is that we also have clinical appointments. So effectively, we are rented out from the university by the province to do lots of different kind of work, mostly clinical consultation work and policy work. So that's a bit about us. We do have a master's program in health ethics. So this is a 2-year program that consists in students doing 6 courses. We also have a practicum component to our program. So that consists in 40 hours of applied bioethics work, generally distributed fairly evenly across research, policy, and clinical areas. And it really involves students shadowing us in our various kinds of clinical and other applied responsibilities. The degree also involves a final project, which can be a thesis or 3 research papers or a capstone project. And the application deadline is has been for many years, February 1st to start studying in September. Okay, can you go to the next slide? Thank you. Okay, so I wanted to announce a symposium that we're hosting at the end of September on the topic of MAID. So the title of the symposium is going to be, it's not a very neutral title, but anyway, Made in Canada, a sober second look. So it will take place at Memorial here in St. John's, but at our Signal Hill campus. So the university has a campus that is in this very beautiful location right near the National Historic Site, Signal Hill. And we're welcoming abstracts on any aspect of this topic of MAID, due by June 7th, 300 words sent to that email address. And we do have our 3 keynote speakers already lined up for that symposium. And the Canadian Journal of Bioethics has agreed to publish the proceedings, so that's exciting. And finally, I thought I would just mention that we, for a few years now, have hosted the Impact Ethics blog. So you can check it out at impactethics.ca. And if you want to make a submission to our blog, you can do that at impactethics@mun.ca. And that's everything. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Flynn. I'm a bit biased. I did my master's at Memorial in the Master's of Health Ethics program, so I can't recommend it enough. Moving on to our moderator today. So our moderator today is Dr. Eric Mathison. So Dr. Eric Mathison is an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Toronto Scarborough. Previously was a clinical ethicist for Alberta Health Services, and he continues to do clinical and organizational ethics consulting for health systems and companies in Canada and the United States. Dr. Mathison was a postdoctoral fellow at Baylor College of Medicine and has a PhD in philosophy from the University of Toronto. His research interests include assisted dying, the goals of medicine, and clinical practice. And our speaker today is Dr. Jenny or Dr. Jennifer Blumenthal-Barby. So Dr. Jenny Blumenthal-Barby is a philosopher bioethicist whose research focuses primarily on decision-making and ethics. Dr. Blumenthal-Barby has been the recipient of a Greenwald Faculty Scholar Award in Bioethics, a Pfizer Bioethics Fellowship, and has served as the principal investigator on 4 awards from the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute to study and improve decision-making in advanced heart failure. Recently, she received funding as a co-principal investigator to study ethics and decision-making in pediatric deep brain stimulation through the NIH Brain Initiative. She has also received funding as principal investigator from AHRQ to study the utilization of AI machine learning system that predicts personalized risks using big data. She has published more than 130 articles in bioethics, philosophy, medical journals, as well as served as on several expert panels and committees related to bioethics and medical decision-making. She's an associate editor of the Journal of Medical Ethics and the American Journal of Bioethics, where she also serves on the editorial board. She is an elected member of the board of directors for the American Society of Bioethics and Humanities, ASBH. She has a book out with MIT Press, Good Ethics and Bad Choices, The Relevance of Behavioral Economics for Medical Ethics. And in 2023, she was elected a Hastings Center Fellow. And I will turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Zach. Welcome, everybody, and welcome, Jenny. Jenny, I'd like to start with some of your views that you've written about. Why should we abandon personhood as a concept in bioethics?
Hi, Eric. Thanks for having me. Recently I published an article in A Job that I provocatively titled The End of Personhood. And the motivation for that article was actually based on some of my experience in a clinical setting, embedding with a team who worked with patients with disorders of consciousness. So these were patients who were, for example, in a minimally conscious state. And one of the things that I noticed in that setting is that the way that philosophers would typically talk about those sorts of cases in bioethics discourse was to talk about concepts of personhood. And for example, if individuals in a minimally conscious state were really quote unquote persons, or if they had personhood. And when I started talking with the care team members for those patients and some of their family members as part of our research, we quickly got the sense that that was a very offensive and off-putting way to even think about characterizing these individuals. And so that caused me to do a deeper dive into sort of thinking about the philosophical utility of this concept of personhood and whether we get as much mileage out of it as we might think that we get. And so in the paper, I sort of have a fresh take on the concept and argue that the concept is not only offensive to many people and their families where we have been applying it in bioethics, but also that we don't need it. And so, for example, I introduced concepts of just thinking about respect and respect for individuals, and also thinking about welfare and individual interests. And I argue in the paper that those are the sort of core ethical questions that we should ask in many debates where we have traditionally quickly gone to the concept and question of whether the individual is a quote unquote person.
So this seems to be a question of kind of how we should conceptualize things. And there's this common, like to speak in like broad generalities, there's this common belief among non-philosophers that when philosophers start doing bioethics, that they tend to make things too complicated or contribute stuff that makes it messier and hinders us actually being able to kind of have helpful progress in a clinical setting. Personhood seems to be this case where philosophers offered this concept. It was simplified things in a way because it was this category that made things into a binary, and doing that despite the simplification actually made things much worse. It led to these bad results, as you discussed. So does this vindicate the philosophers who say like it needs to be messy, it needs to be complicated? How should we think about concepts like this?
That's a great question. I think that you're right that concepts can serve as useful heuristics for us. So it's kind of nice to, have sorts of philosophical questions around a topic, like, for example, how we ought to treat an individual who's in a minimally conscious state, how we ought to treat animals, and notice commonalities, sort of that, well, what we're getting at here is something like thinking about rational capabilities or capabilities to experience certain things or feel certain things. And let's just put a label on all of that because it does simplify it. And so let's talk about personhood, for example. But I do think that what can happen is that we then start to anchor too heavily on the concept. And I think there are other examples of this I can talk about. And so in a way, it does sort of oversimplify the conversation and we lose some of the nuance. So I think it kind of cuts both ways. I think philosophers love to come up with like concepts for things. And I think that concepts are great and they can sometimes serve as a useful heuristic and they can illuminate things for us. And I think they can sometimes not match with clinical realities and they can sometimes oversimplify things and we kind of lose nuance.
What about in the other direction? So there are some philosophers who argue that it's just impossible to apply philosophical theory to bioethics or to move from philosophical bioethics to clinical practice. The theories get watered down too much. This was a criticism that came up in the pandemic or following the pandemic. What do you think about this concern kind of from the other direction, that it's just like any attempt to kind of simplify things for it to be practical is just going to be too difficult?
Yeah, so what I love about the intersection of philosophy and like clinical ethics or medicine is really the back and forth and the interplay. And so I think that philosophy can really enrich clinical ethics and medicine, and vice versa. So I think there are ways in which actually bringing some of the clinical realities, not only does it sort of not, dumb down the philosophical concepts, but I think that it actually makes them more rich, and it causes us to further think about things that we hadn't thought about, or distinctions or nuances. So my view is that, and one thing that originally drew me to bioethics is this sense that real life, real cases, on the ground issues can really just make the philosophy a lot more interesting and challenging and rich. And then, of course, how bioethics started as a field is thinking that, the kinds of things that philosophers do, like make arguments and parse out definitions and concepts, that can be really useful to on the ground practice as well. So I actually don't, sort of buy the argument that there are these two camps and their intention. I think that in an ideal world, they would work really well together.
So you mentioned that there are other concepts. I know that some of the other ones that you've written about are coercion and manipulation, and that you've argued that we need to be more fine-grained, that those as concepts and trying to figure out what the conditions of coercion are, for instance, that's not actually going to be that helpful. Can you tell us a bit more about either those ones or just other concepts that you think don't actually offer much use?
Yeah, so those are really great examples. And I got interested in this because I was finishing my PhD in philosophy, and I started hanging out with a group of researchers that did decision psychology. And so they were introducing me to all of this kind of rich data from behavioral economics and decision psychology about the ways in which people actually make decisions, and how we're subject to all these things like framing effects and order effects, and the tone in which information is presented to us. Even like the smell in the room can influence choice. And so this was really, for me, a challenge to thinking about the philosophy side of things, where we had this kind of really rational view of autonomy and autonomous choice and the autonomous decision maker, and really challenged it. And so it got me interested in this area of the ethics of influence. And when I started digging into this space, I found that a lot of the way that philosophers were contributing to this conversation was to sort of bring in, these big labels, like ask the question of, oh, well, if we kind of frame or influence somebody's choice in a particular way, is that coercion or is that manipulation? And so there was a lot of ink spilled over these sort of conceptual terminological debates of whether this counts as an instance of coercion or an instance of manipulation or not. And for me, the really challenging issue was the issue of, well, what ought we to do? Like, is it ethically permissible to do this thing? Is it ethically permissible to frame choice in a certain way when it will, influence a patient? And so that caused me to think that again, concepts are useful, but when you go to apply them in actual cases, what you want to do is just kind of ask the questions more directly or more straightforwardly, rather than having too much over-reliance on the concept, because then you just get into sort of endless conceptual debates, which are philosophically fun, right? But which don't provide a lot of helpful guidance about how we ought to resolve certain issues or cases.
And was this a result, like when I think about kind of the Blumenthal-Barby approach to bioethics, it is like often this like kind of like atomizing of, like that we need to kind of be more fine-grained. Was that something that you recognized like as an approach, or is it a byproduct or like as a result of as you started working on these different areas?
Yeah, it's interesting you point that out, because I hadn't really realized that about my work until you pointed it out. So I guess I'm developing a little bit of a brand there. Yeah, so it wasn't intentional. It was really just, trying to sort of do the best philosophy coming into whatever the debate is. If it's a debate about how we ought to treat patients in a minimally conscious state, if it's a debate about the ethics of influencing choice, and I would go straight to the philosophy literature, and I would find the major concepts at play, and I would try to use them, and I would see how much mileage I could get out of them. How much mileage can I get out of personhood? How much mileage can I get out of the concept of coercion or manipulation or undue influence? And I would often find that I couldn't get enough mileage out of it for all of the ways that I wanted to resolve certain on the ground practical questions that I had in that space. And so then I wanted to figure out, well, how can I answer these questions? Because the questions are still there. The normative ethical questions are still there. And so for me, I often just arrived at this conclusion that the way to get the answers was to ask a very kind of contextual approach, that often the answers are going to vary by case, by context, by particulars. And so that's just sort of, I guess, a conclusion that I've arrived at, or an insight that I've arrived at through just trying to do bioethics and do philosophy in various settings.
So you've been one of the bioethicists or philosophers who's done a lot of work on, kind of taking on or dealing with, wrestling with the kind of economics turn of Sunstein and Thaler and Daniel Kahneman's work and psychology. Like in very kind of big picture terms, like I think that nudging and other concepts like that have been taken on in healthcare, and I think there is more nuance around how we think about autonomy. Not just like individuals on islands blocked off from kind of any kind of influence. Do you see that is that there's more that needs to be done in that area? Is like, has that been successfully taken on? How do you think about that as a movement?
It's a great question. I feel like we're a little stuck, honestly, because we have this concept, we have this core principle of respect for autonomy, and it's so fundamental, and it's been so fundamental. And we have begun to see challenges to it, right? A lot of concepts from, feminist bioethics and feminist philosophy around just how so many of our decisions are very relational, and they are very influenced by other people, and that's okay. And the sorts of things you're mentioning from decision psychology about how people actually make decisions and how susceptible decision making is to influence, and that we can't escape that. And I feel like the traditional notion or concept of autonomy has tried to accommodate those things, and it's tried to stretch, but it's gotten very awkward. So I think what I'm seeing in the literature is that people are now very willing to concede all of those things. The kind of original concept of autonomy that we had, which was very much based on this model of the individual making rational, deliberative decisions, it's not super tenable anymore. We know that we need to change it. We know that we need to stretch it, but we also are so anchored in it historically that it's been hard for us to really make the adjustments that we need to make, quite honestly. And so I think the other thing that I've observed, which I think is interesting, is I think that you're right to say that in the clinical world and in bioethics, we are increasingly realizing that that's not realistic, that they aren't these kind of rational, deliberative decision makers. But I recently went to a philosophy conference, and that was still the way that they talked about the concept of autonomy. The whole conference was on sort of agency and autonomy and influence, and it had some really, top philosophers there. And that was still the dominant understanding of agency and autonomy, was like rational, deliberative choice. And anything like nudges or influence that interfered with that was sort of a threat to this kind of thing that is worthy of respect. So I don't know. I feel like we're getting it, but we're also a little bit stuck, if that makes sense.
Sure. So personhood and manipulation are concepts that you're skeptical of. Are there concepts that philosophers use that you wish that non-philosopher bioethicists were more aware of?
This is one thing that I really like about this intersection of philosophy and bioethics, is what I might call sort of like, I like being a translator. So I like looking at what's going on in the philosophy literature that I think is really cool and interesting, and sort of trying to bring that into the bioethics discourse. So I do think that there are some cool concepts. Some of them are increasingly making their way into the bioethics discourse. So one that maybe many listeners might be familiar with is this concept of epistemic injustice, which has gotten, it's a concept that was written about by Miranda Fricker in the philosophy literature like over a decade ago. And if you look at bioethics articles in maybe the last 2 years, you'll just see this explosion of ones that have this title of epistemic injustice. So I think that's such a cool example. And the concept is basically that playing off of ideas of justice, where we can treat people wrongly, or we can, not treat them as they deserve. If we sort of bring in epistemology, then we get this idea that we can also wrong people in their capacity as knowers. So we don't give them enough kind of credit or deference as we should in terms of thinking that they are a person that can bring knowledge to the table and kind of respecting their views and their self as a knower. So that's this idea of epistemic injustice. So I think that's a great example of a concept from philosophy that has recently made its way into bioethics and opened up a kind of new category or a new lens of ways to view certain things that have gone on in medicine. For example, ways in which we don't listen to patients, especially patients of a certain gender or background. So that's a great example. Another example of a concept that I think is really cool philosophically, but maybe hasn't made its way into bioethics as much, is the concept of an A-leaf in contrast to a B-leaf. So this is a concept that was developed by the philosopher Tamar Gendler, again, probably maybe in 2007 or something like that in philosophy. But it's such a cool concept because the idea is that she says that we sometimes have these things called A-leafs, which are more habitual belief-like attitudes, but they might be in tension with our actual beliefs about something. So she gives an example of you go to the Grand Canyon, you're walking over that kind of glass bridge, and your belief is that you're safe. You totally know you're safe. You're not going to fall through this glass bridge. But she says that we often have what she calls an A-leaf, which is that we affectively feel like we're unsafe. And it's kind of close to our belief. And I think it's such a psychologically and philosophically interesting concept. And I think you can actually explain a lot of what we might see in certain cases of patient decision-making. For example, when we're scratching our heads or we're puzzled about why a patient seems to be responding a certain way to something or making a decision that they're making, I think we could actually get a lot of mileage out of this concept of A-leafs that Gendler develops. And I haven't actually seen a lot of discussion of that in the bioethics literature. So those are just some quick examples that come to mind.
Yeah. Do you think that some of this stuff, so like when I think about Atul Gawande, like I really love Being Mortal, but I feel like bioethicists got scooped on that. Like that should have been written by a bioethicist. Are there other concepts like that kind of go in the opposite directions of things like A-leaves that where there's like could be more uptake from philosophers that could have like, you know, go in the direction kind of clinic to the other way?
I'm sure there are. I can't think of any off the top of my head. I mean, you've been in I imagine people who practice clinical ethics. I don't practice clinical ethics, but I imagine that there might be just concepts or norms or principles or something like that in that space that I don't know if any come to mind for you, Eric, that you think would be really rich for philosophers to explore.
Well, one that I think that you mentioned is that, so I've done some work on coercion, and I think that like so much of the philosophy literature is just about the necessary and sufficient conditions of coercion. And like, even if you look at Beecham and Childress, they talk about the concept, but there's actually just like a lot of different questions built into it that about whether coercion is always wrong when it happens, whether it invalidates consent in all cases. And I actually think that these are issues that like in practice that clinical ethicists see a lot, but that it hasn't really been taken up to kind of be conceptualized I mean, even in the kind of, clinical ethics like space, like there hasn't been a lot of discussion about that.
Yeah, that's a great example. And, way back when I was in grad school, I wrote my dissertation on ambivalence. And it was really what had happened is that I had been doing a clinical rotation where I saw a case of a patient who was ambivalent or kind of indecisive about a particular life and death decision that he had to make. And I went to the philosophy literature and the bioethics literature, and there was not a lot of theorizing on ambivalence. And so that was just a great space to sort of develop out. So I think, again, this back and forth between what is being developed in the philosophy literature that could be used in the clinical setting, and then vice versa, sort of finding the nuance and the questions in the clinical space that I think could be really rich for philosophers to develop out. That's what's really exciting for me at the intersection.
Another article that you recently co-authored with some colleagues, including a psychiatrist, was that your group sent out a survey to a number of psychiatrists in the United States and gave them 2 case studies involving patients who had basically received like every kind of treatment available for them, and then ask the psychiatrist what they would do in that case. So I found the results quite shocking, that many of the psychiatrists surveyed said that they would continue to offer treatment knowing that it was going to be, likely be non-beneficial. So I wonder, though, about what you see as a philosopher's role in that type of research.
Yeah, so I think what was interesting about that is that so the person that was the lead author of the study, Brent Kios, he is a psychiatrist. He's also a philosopher. He has a PhD in philosophy. So what was interesting is that when we first started talking about this area, it was really a more philosophical or normative question about the appropriateness of stopping treatment in certain psychiatric settings or cases that you believed was futile. So it started from a sort of philosophical conversation about, the normative question. But then it quickly led to us just wondering, well, what happens in practice? And I think this goes back to our conversation about concepts. We were also very aware that the concept of futility is a very kind of laden concept, right? It's value laden, it's philosophically laden, it's normatively laden. And so we were curious about whether psychiatrists would provide care or not in these futile cases. And we were curious about the ethics of it. But we knew we needed to be careful with that term. So when we designed the survey, we actually did not use the word futile or futility at all. We really just described cases where it was very clear that, as you said, we had one case of a patient who had a borderline personality disorder and another case of a patient who had major depression. And we wrote the hypothetical vignette and had different psychiatrists help us write them in ways that it was very clear that everything that had been tried and it still wasn't getting better. And then we asked the respondents if they would provide different kinds of interventions in that case. We had 4 different kinds of interventions, like hospital admissions, psychotherapy, med changes, neurostimulation. And then we asked them if they thought that would be helpful or not. So we were really asking them the question about their views on futility without using the concept of futility. And as you say, we were also quite surprised at the finding, which was, basically, to put it kind of straightforwardly, yes, they would be willing to provide futile care, in the sense that I think it was about maybe in 40% of the cases, we found respondents indicated they were likely to provide a treatment that they did not think was helpful. And then that raises all kinds of ethical questions, right? Well, is that a waste of resources? Is it, if they have an obligation to patient welfare and beneficence, is that obligation being fulfilled or not when you're providing care that you don't think is actually beneficial? And then also kind of interesting ethical questions around, like, deception. If they really think that the care is not going to be helpful to the patient, what are they telling the patient? They're maybe telling the patient that the care may be helpful, but they believe on the inside that the care is not going to be helpful. So there's interesting questions about deception. Although maybe we didn't bring in the concept of A-leaf, but maybe you could bring in the concept of A-leaf and say they A-leaved that the treatment would be helpful.
Yeah.
So that was a really fun paper.
Yeah. So empirical bioethics has been around for a while now, and experimental philosophy, or XPhi, has also been around. So, one thing I like about that paper is that you kind of like went out and got the data, and then it was philosophical, lots to comment on. And so do you see that as like something that philosophers should be, or I guess philosophical bioethics, in terms of kind of uncovering like what it's like on the ground, finding that actual data? Does that seem like an area for kind of that philosophers should be taking up more often?
Yeah, there is a book that I really love, and I actually used to teach with my med students. It's called Methods of Medical Ethics by Sugarman and Salmazy. And that book, it really lays out lots of different empirical and normative approaches to bioethics. But it also talks about the ways in which empirical bioethics and normative or philosophical bioethics can interact in appropriate ways, right? And so it's just a really nice illustration of ways in which, empirical data. So philosophers might they might make an ought statement. They might say we ought to be doing things this way or that way. And then empirically, we can come in and we can collaborate and say, well, is that actually happening or not? Why is it happening? Why is it happening or not happening a certain way? So I think there are lots of examples where it's a really fruitful collaboration to just empirically go in or experimentally go in and see what happens. What do people do? What do people think? What are all the kind of quirks and unexpected findings there? And then, of course, that raises lots of issues where we might need to change practices that we uncover that are unethical. But I do think that it also uncovers lots of rich philosophical and ethical questions to explore. And in empirical bioethics articles, you kind of report your findings and then you have a discussion section. And I think the discussion section is such a great place to just dig into some of those philosophical issues. And so people who are empirically trained and reading those articles, they dip into the discussion and they start to dip into and see some of the ways in which philosophy can actually be useful to help make sense of some of the findings or illuminate them or just have a really interesting lens on some of the findings. So I love that kind of collaborative work of kind of, empirical or experimental philosophy with, normative conceptual analysis.
I just want to let everyone know as we go along that if there's a question that comes to mind, feel free to put it in the Q&A and we can include it as we go. So thinking about collaboration and I guess the kind of space of what philosophical bioethics can contribute, I think that there was a period of time where philosophers kind of went a different way, but now I think there's more kind of interaction. But still thinking about, the ASBH conference and other big bioethics conferences, that it's not a place that philosophers, even philosophers doing bioethics, that they attend anymore or attend as much. What should we do about this as an issue, and what are some ways of kind of getting more collaboration?
Yeah. So I think that some of this is structural and some of this is attitudinal. So there are structural issues that I think we can be mindful of. For example, in conferences, if we have, 10-minute talks, that kind of venue is really good for displaying quick results, right? Like, here's our table with our data. Whereas it's not as friendly to a philosophical take, which takes a little bit longer to, motivate an argument, develop out an argument, defend it, think about objections, that sort of thing. So that's an example where I think just thinking about the structural issues of ways in which we can be more inclusive of philosophers and philosophical methods in bioethics is really important. And then the other piece is attitudinal. So on sort of both sides of things, I think philosophers really being motivated to see the value of collaborating with non-philosophers and seeing, for example, that if you do an empirical, or experimental survey on something, you might uncover lots of really interesting things that open up lines of philosophical inquiry for you. And then also vice versa. So I think sort of people who are non-philosophers seeing the value of philosophical analysis and lens to things. So I think, I've collaborated with many non-philosophers, with psychologists, with clinicians from all sorts of specialties. And I've really found that it's made me a better philosopher. It's made my philosophy better because it has pushed it to be more nuanced and it's challenged it in certain ways. And it also has made the philosophy just more practically useful, which is what I think we care a lot about in bioethics. I've also collaborated with a lot of philosophers, which I don't know, Eric, maybe you have a sense, but I feel like that's less common. It's becoming more common for philosophers to collaborate with non-philosophers, but I don't know how much philosophers really collaborate or co-author with each other these days.
I think it's perhaps more common, but I would say that like seeing two people, like I've co-authored a number of papers, but seeing more than that, I think is pretty unusual. Whereas I think that's right that like a lot of your work is kind of a team of folks, of kind of a mix of different backgrounds. Do you think that there is that then philosopher bioethicists should just be, a kind of easy way is just more collaboration.
I think totally. More collaboration, just embedding yourself with teams of people, with research teams who have empirical projects or funding, with clinical teams. I think that goes a long way to thinking about sort of just growing the role of philosophers in bioethics and increasing collaboration. I would really also push philosophers to collaborate with other philosophers, and not just one, but there have been a couple of papers that I have been involved in that have been a team of people, maybe 5 people, but where like 3 of us have been philosophers, or 4 of us, or something like that. And it's been such a rich experience. And I think about what I see a lot is philosophers going on social media sites like X or Facebook or something like that, and they ask other philosophers like, hey, what do you think about this argument? Can you recommend readings for this? I'm trying to think through this new concept. What other concepts should I be thinking about? And I just want to say, and you see this kind of happening, then people are making great suggestions, and then the one person just goes off and they write their individual paper on it. And to me, it's like, wow, that was such a rich dialogue that I just watched happen among all these philosophers on social media or at a conference. And it would be so cool if they all got together and wrote a collaborative paper.
I wonder about as clinical ethics moves increasingly towards professionalization, there's a kind of like plasticity that terms kind of get cemented in. So thinking about like the 4 principles of bioethics, for instance, which are useful as a heuristic, and it's like so often the way that we introduce people to bioethics. But I think speaking to many philosophers who do bioethics, that they would hold that pretty loosely as an approach, or it has value, but maybe not as much as people often assume it does. And so I guess I wonder what you think about this kind of move, that as professionalization goes on, there's this expectation of kind of coherence or like agreement in the field. But I think that many philosophers, like, our job is to like kind of challenge these sorts of things, like as in your case of personhood. So how should we think about professionalization, and how should we think about what level of agreement we need to get in order to actually be practically contributing?
Yeah, this is such a good question, because I think there's this way in which philosophers, other scholars, but philosophers especially, were some of the early contributors to the field of bioethics, right? And so they created a lot of mileage for the field in terms of developing core concepts, core principles, and that was incredibly helpful, because I think there was a realization that there was a need for some kind of consensus, and there was a need for some kind of a presentation of like a framework. And so I think that we are having to always sort of walk this line of, in the philosophy world, we just can debate things forever, endlessly, and there's very little agreement on anything. But when we move into spaces like bioethics or the clinical world, we do need some kind of agreed upon frameworks and principles and concepts. And so I think it's useful to sort of put those out there and have consensus and anchor on those. But I think we do need to grow and progress and change over the years. And so what I would say is just philosophers, I think part of what their job can be in bioethics is that kind of just like constant like challenge and development of some of the core concepts or principles that we continue to use. And I would also say suggesting new ones to replace it. So I think philosophers are really good at critique, but sometimes they're not as good with coming up with a kind of constructive offering to replace what they're critiquing. And people need to hang their hats on something, right? So if you're going to critique something, offer up like an alternative approach, an alternative principle, a new principle. Give it a name. People love names, right? So it sounds kind of stupid, but this is the psychology, like the branding of things too. Like give somebody something that has a name that they can understand, that makes some sort of intuitive sense, that they can use, that they can apply. But I think it is important for us to kind of continue to grow and challenge in our concepts.
So we've had a couple of questions, which I'll kind of summarize in the direction I was going to go anyway. That when I did a PhD in philosophy and then went into clinical ethics and realized that there was so much that I just didn't know that I didn't know about, like what the kinds of ethical issues that arise in healthcare on a regular basis. So obviously it'd be different for thinking about clinical ethics specifically, but thinking about philosophical bioethics, if you were to like create the ideal pathway, education pathway for somebody who's going to go into philosophical bioethics, that to what extent or in what ways should that include more clinical experience than what I think many people often get?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for me, the ideal pathway for somebody that wants to go into philosophical bioethics would be, of course, you're getting your PhD in philosophy, but part of your time during your PhD is to do something like a clinical rotation. And I would say do it a little early on. So I did my clinical rotation probably in my second year of my graduate studies. And I think that was incredibly useful because it just kind of foreshadowed, it gave me a sense of humility. It gave me a sense of the messiness and the things that I didn't know that I wasn't learning about in my classes and in my grad program. And it also foreshadowed a little bit sort of what a philosopher could bring to bear if they were in a clinical setting. So I think that is the first thing, is getting a little bit of exposure through an internship, and just being proactive. You may not be fortunate enough to be in a graduate program that has that built in, but find community, hospitals or ethics committees or bioethicists sort of in your town or in a vicinity you can get to, and just try to seek out some of those opportunities to just get a little bit of exposure and experience. And I think that'll go a long way. And then I think the ideal, sort of what you've done, Eric, is after the PhD program in philosophy, getting some formal fellowship training in clinical ethics, so that you really have sort of spent sufficient time in both worlds. And that's sort of the ideal product, I think, in terms of a philosopher bioethicist, is someone who has had both sets of training and experience.
Thinking about medical education for physicians or for other healthcare providers, Baylor College of Medicine, of course, has a med school. From an ethics point of view, what would you want to change about medical education to improve ethical outcomes?
Well, one thing I would want to change about medical education is probably what you mentioned a couple questions ago, which is learning the simplified view of bioethics and sort of philosophical bioethics, like just learning the 4 principles. I think it's, of course, important for students to learn the 4 principles because it's going to be a sort of foundational framework that they can take into their clinical practice. But I think stretching beyond that, and digging into some of the other philosophical concepts or ideas or questions or debates, and going into that space a little bit, is something that I would really recommend, because otherwise I think students leave medical school just thinking that ethics is a little bit, I mean, it's not taken super seriously because it seems very simple and superficial. And I think that's a shame, because it is incredibly complicated and rich, and it is an inevitable part of what they will spend their time doing, regardless of whether or not they have an interest in ethics. So that's one change I would make. The second change I would make is probably getting people to think a little bit about the distinction between learning about ethics and actually having the appropriate motivation to be ethical or behave ethically. I think we do a good job in medical school of teaching students sort of consensus around confidentiality and consent, and but I don't know if we really get them to understand that when they're in practice, all the drivers, all the psychology, the structural, the hidden curriculum, their individual psychology, a lot is going to drive them away from that, and that's to be expected. And I think just anticipating that and kind of doing some training in terms of more, I guess, virtue-based development or attitudinal-based development, to just be aware of that and really be motivated or have an ethos of ethics rather than just knowing the principles or knowing the concepts, are a couple of changes I would make.
Yeah. The last question for this portion. So you've written about artificial intelligence. There have been many studies coming out now about artificial intelligence in healthcare and in clinical ethics specifically. When you think forward, 5 or 10 years, what do you see of the role of artificial intelligence specifically for ethics in healthcare?
Yeah, so interesting. I recently collaborated on a paper where we basically gave ChatGPT an ethics case that we give our med students, and we asked it to conduct an analysis. And it did a really good job of conducting the analysis, quite frankly. And so you can imagine, to this question of what role is artificial intelligence going to play in ethics education and the practice of clinical ethics, you might think that it might start becoming like a consultant, of even doing an initial kind of run by the AI of like, how should we handle this case? What should we do? So I think that's super interesting. Another thing that's interesting is a paper that just came out in AJOB on, it's written by actually a lot of philosophers on this paper, but it's on, they call it a personalized preference predictor, but the vision is that we, when we're trying to make decisions for patients, when surrogates and care team members are trying to make decisions for patients who are not capacitated, we can develop an algorithm where the algorithm takes all of this data about the patient, about their previous medical choices, about their preferences. And they argue that such an algorithm is sort of technically feasible. We're getting close to being able to develop something like that. And they also argue that it is ethically defensible. And it's an interesting argument. But those are just a couple of examples. There's lots of examples of how we are going to and we are using AI in medical practice. But I think those are a couple of interesting examples of how AI might be used in medical ethics practice or education.
Great. Okay, well, thank you very much, Jenny. I have many more questions, but I will pause that if other people have questions that they would like me to ask Jenny, then please put them in the chat. Yeah, so there was a question about, I think, going back to kind of philosophy training for clinical ethicists. So I'll just read the question. It says that I think that some of the challenge is a lack of appreciation on the part of academically based philosophers of the specific skills and knowledge involved in doing clinical ethics work and taking that seriously in philosophical work. Curious as to your thoughts.
I totally agree. I think that there are the skills. So I do not myself do clinical ethics, so I have some humility in answering this question. But I think that the skills of doing clinical ethics are the traditional analytical philosophical skills, but also what has to be developed that philosophers probably haven't spent a lot of time developing are communication skills, virtue-based skills of empathy, interpersonal-based skills. And so those are skills that people who have not practiced clinical ethics, like philosophers who have not practiced it, probably underappreciate. But I think that this goes back to some of our earlier conversation, Eric. I think that they probably also underappreciate how the complexities and the nuance of each individual case complicate the philosophical analysis. So, I've heard, for example, some philosophers and even non-philosophers say things like, well, it's just not really interesting to be a philosopher in clinical ethics anymore because like all the work has already been done, right? The philosophers came in early on, they developed the frameworks, they developed the concepts, and all you need to do now is really just apply them, right? That's kind of what the bioethicist does or the clinical ethics ethicist does, is just like this straightforward application. So I would say, and you can probably speak a lot more to this than I can, but I would say the application is probably not straightforward. It's probably very complicated. And that also you find that often the philosophical frameworks or tools that you have just aren't enough. So you have to invent new ones. You have to do new philosophical work or thinking for how to handle a case or think about a case. So I think those are probably a couple ways from my perspective that there's an underappreciation.
Yeah, I think I've learned that it goes definitely in both directions. That in clinical ethics, that there's cases that come up that just and never thought about, and that just are not discussed in the philosophical bioethics literature. And I think coercion is a good case in point that I had no interest in thinking about coercion until vaccine mandates came up during the pandemic, and there were people who were claiming that vaccine mandates are coercive, that they therefore they undermine consent, and so they're wrong, and that didn't sound very plausible to me. But I thought, oh, there's got to be some, Beecham and Childress. Someone has written about when does coercion undermine consent to treatment? How coercive does it have to be? Given that laws are coercive, other things in healthcare are coercive sometimes. And so I thought it would be a very easy exercise to find the answer to that, and then I could, send that paper out or something. And just realize that like philosophers had not. There's like dozens of books, thousands of papers written about coercion, but it just, I couldn't find anyone who had actually taken up this aspect of it. Another one, that I've more recently written about is that just that we have a very clear pathway, and this is, I think, a case where philosopher, it is kind of not exactly wrapped up, but fairly, we have an answer that if a person lacks decision-making capacity, then we have a process, they get a substitute decision maker. That's all like defined in the law and so on. But the other conditions of undermining informed consent, such as coercion. So if a person gets coerced, what do we do with them? We know for sure that they've been coerced, but the theory says that they can't give informed consent, valid informed consent. So what do we do? Do we give them a substitute decision maker? That doesn't seem right. Do we give, can they just not make a decision? That doesn't seem right. So that's another, just seemed like that kind of interplay that that it kind of, I think, takes kind of being in both parts of it to see that there's a huge gap there.
Yeah, that's interesting. I had a similar story for, when I first started getting interested in the nudge debates and literature, which were happening at the time, mostly not yet in bioethics or medicine, but mostly in, econ and, policy and those kinds of areas. And then thinking about these cases where, okay, you use some sort of, framing effects to get a patient to make a particular choice, or order effects or something like that. And all right, well, what are the philosophers saying about that? So you go to the kind of philosophy literature, or in my case, the philosophical bioethics literature. And there was the kind of, Faden and Beauchamp's theory of informed consent, and really, really great philosophy. But it was sort of this classification of, well, we've got rational persuasion, we've got coercion, and those are the two extremes. Rational persuasion is usually giving somebody the reasons, giving them the arguments. And then you have coercion, which is a kind of threat to take something away from them or do something that is bad for them. And then everything in between, they had labeled manipulation. And so that just seemed unsatisfying, because that was lumping a lot of things in between. So I thought that it needed some more conceptual parsing out. And so, for example, not putting something on the table, leaving it off the table, that would be manipulation. But changing the order in which you talk about risks and benefits, that would also be manipulation. But those seemed like very different things to me that needed some parsing out. So one, I thought, oh, we've got to do more philosophical work here to kind of parse out this middle category. And it also seemed to me problematic to label it all manipulation, because philosophers had, there was some debate in the philosophy literature about whether manipulation was value neutral or always bad. But many people had kind of defined it as something that was bad, right? You're going against somebody's rational capabilities in a way that's bad for them or takes advantage of them or something like that. And so it also just had this connotation of this bad thing. So that sort of led to a lot of work to think, well, we've got to do more work in this middle space. Manipulation just isn't going to cut it, even though that was sort of what was on offer from the philosophy literature.
Yeah. We have a question asking you to expand on a-leafs, so the concept is from Tamar Gendler, and can you say a bit more about how it might apply in a clinical setting?
Yeah. So in the philosophy, and not that I'm a philosopher of belief or something like that, but my understanding of one approach to the philosophy of beliefs is that some people have said beliefs are sort of like a cluster concept, right? Belief, of course, it has this cognitive aspect about like, what do you think? But belief also has an affective component and a behavioral component. So some people have said it's sort of like this cluster concept of belief that has like cognitive, affective, and behavioral component. But if we just sort of, then we can start to do some parsing. Well, wonder if we just carve out the component that is like the more affective and maybe behavioral, but like the cognitive part goes in a totally different direction. And that's, I think, this notion of a leaf of like, again, you're standing on this bridge and you feel really scared. You feel like you're going to fall. You're maybe even acting like you're going to fall, but like cognitively something different is happening. How is this useful for thinking about like in bioethics? Again, I think it's really patients. Sometimes patients might, for example, say that we give them a prognosis that is not good. And it seems to us like they don't really believe their prognosis, like they're not getting it, like it's a little bit off. Are they self-deceiving? What's going on there? And I think one way to make sense of what's going on is to think about an A-leaf. Maybe they A-leaf something way more optimistic. And what you're seeing is really an A-leaf, right? Like, wow, they're acting really optimistic. They're acting like they don't really get it. But that cognitive component, maybe if you kind of dug deeper and got them to focus in on just like the cognitive component, they would get it. They would get that their prognosis is bad, and they would have like the accurate belief that their prognosis is bad. Now, I think that gets into interesting questions of, well, what do we need for like kind of valid decision making or valid informed consent? Do we need like the A leaves to be accurate? Do we need the B leaves to be accurate? Again, I think there's a lot of kind of interesting philosophical space to explore there. Another related concept is this. This is really not coming out of philosophy, but more coming out of like psychology and psycholinguistics. Is this concept of gist understanding? This was developed by in the work of Valerie Reyna, who's a psycholinguist and decision scientist. But she sort of says, look, oftentimes, especially in medicine and medical ethics, when people talk about understanding and informed consent and, whether the kind of patient really understands the risks and benefits, what we're doing is we're asking patients to repeat a bunch of stuff back to us verbatim. Like, can you recall for me what I told you about your prognosis? Can you recall for me some of the risks and benefits? And if they can't do that accurate recall, we might start to have questions about whether they have adequate understanding that is sufficient enough for them to make an informed decision or give consent. And she sort of says, well, that's such a like quantitative, like verbatim way to think about understanding. So she introduces this notion of just understanding, which is sort of, she says, set aside whether the person can repeat back certain things to you, like cognitively. Do they get the gist? Do they get the key takeaways? And it's more of this kind of narrative picture about like their health state and their medical decision. So she talks about the gist as like the key takeaways. Do they, for example, get that they're sick? Do they get that there are like some trade-offs to make? And if they don't get this device, like they might likely die. Yeah, okay, they get the gist, regardless of whether or not they can repeat back to us like very specific things that we're asking them. So I think to me, it's a really interesting, again, bringing in this concept from a different area, not philosophy, but from psychology, and bringing that into bioethics and thinking about, that's a cool concept. Does that make us think about cases in different ways, or does it complicate things in ways that we traditionally haven't been thinking about in bioethics when we have our kind of more narrow view of understanding?
Yeah, I think another perhaps kind of application of A-leaves is for healthcare providers, like that we've had situations where we have a discussion about kind of the ethically permissible scope of options, and then they will say something like, I like, they won't say it exactly like this, but like, I follow the premises, like I get, like I'm on board with everything, and yet because of some aspect of it, somebody in the comments said as well that perhaps aggressive interventions for a patient and their loved ones like just can't get on board with it. That there's even if the understanding is there, they like get it, they like accept the evidence, they're not like disputing it, but there's some kind of block, and perhaps A-leaves can explain that aspect of it.
I think another concept that philosophers are very familiar with, that is sort of useful in some of these cases in thinking about like clinical issues and decision making, this concept of so-called second order desires, developed by the philosopher Harry Frankfurt. And this concept has been around in philosophy since the 70s, but Frankfurt's idea is that we all have a certain like desire, like we, you know, want to go out and, you know, eat a huge ice cream sundae instead of going for a run or something like that. Or even patients might like have a desire for a certain medical treatment. And so what Frankfurt says is, well, that's not what is really morally relevant, is not necessarily person's just like immediate first order desire. It's really how they feel about that desire. Like, what's their view on that desire, right? So a patient decides they want a certain treatment. Now take a step back and think about like your desire for that treatment. Is that something that you really kind of identify as like, yeah, that is me, that is what I really want? Or are you like, ooh, that's not what I really want? And so I think that when I first entered into the clinical space, I was just, you know, I saw these cases of patients making decisions that seemed puzzling to me. And I wish that people were having more conversations about like, people are like, oh, that's their desire. That's what they said that they wanted. And they seem like base level capacitated. So that's what we have to do. And I was like, well, wait a minute. The philosophy literature would say like, well, what really matters is that kind of deeper questioning about not just what does that person want, but like, let's take a step back and think about, does that seem to cohere with, you know, everything else that we know about them, or like what would they would want at some kind of deeper or more reflective level, or something like that. So again, I think that's a just kind of space that's ripe for exploration.
Yeah. There's a point from Meredith here who says that in French that the term futility is translated as therapeutic relentlessness, or almost like harassing people through treatment. And she says that the language difference is really interesting, particularly when Francophone teams are talking with Anglophone families, and you can tell there's some talking past each other that's occurring because of the different connotations of the words.
That is fascinating. Yeah, because the English, it's very just like non-beneficial treatment, right?
Yeah, therapeutic relentlessness is a much like richer concept.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that might affect A-leaves as well. I have one kind of more big picture question is that I have this view, and I guess like sometimes I'm not totally sure like how strong it is, but it does seem to me that that bioethics, there are fewer kind of big swings. Stuff like personhood doesn't matter as much, doesn't matter. That it seems like more kind of like we're getting in the weeds, we're like working out details on stuff. This is not true all the time. There are kind of people who are trying to like kind of challenge bigger picture things. But first of all, do you think that my intuition is right about this? Like, are there fewer kind of trying to like reorder stuff in a big way? And then like, what should we make of that?
I think it's an interesting observation, and it is probably right. A couple of reasons for it. Like in the US, I can say a couple of things. One is that I think that a lot of bioethics funding in the US comes from grants. Funded by the National Institutes for Health, for example. And there's a kind of, if you just come in and propose something really wild, like a new concept that no one's ever thought of, or you're just challenging, some existing framework, those are not the sorts of things that are going to get funded. The sort of things that get funded are sort of sticking with the status quo, making maybe like small incremental improvements. So I think part of it is a structural component, at least here in the US. The other thing I think is thinking about being in the space of medical education and medical practice. I've noticed being in a medical school that there's a little bit of a tendency to come in as an ethicist and want to appear scientific or appear like we have some standards or norms, right? Like we don't have a scientific method, but we've got our basic principles that we all have consensus around, and it's like all stable and it's agreed upon, and to almost present ourselves a little bit more like in the kind of scientific mode of presentation, I would say, which is very, very different than in philosophy. And I would say that kind of tendency or desire to receive some kind of respect or authority in the medical setting, I think probably leads to some of the more like conservative, like lack of, big paradigm shifting concepts or arguments. And I think that this is also an area where, though, just having more philosophers in this space that are willing to kind of take those big swings, and there are big swings happening in philosophy journals, right? I mean, I'm sure there are very big swings happening in philosophy journals at some of our like bioethics ideas or concepts. I mean, I encounter them sometimes, but they don't necessarily make their way into bioethics discourse or like day-to-day practice of bioethicists or clinical ethicists. And so I think, again, just kind of having that dialogue where we can read philosophy journals, or we can have philosophers come in and tell us sort of like, where are the big swings? Where are the mistakes? I mean, a great example is, here in the US, we have our Uniform Definition of Death Act, which was recommended to be revised a couple of years ago. And they went through a really long revision process. I was one of the observers on that committee. It ended up basically stalling out because we couldn't get consensus. We couldn't get agreement about how to revise the definition of death or the act. When I came into bioethics from philosophy, the definition of death was presented to me like a fact, and we taught it to our medical students as a fact, right? And if you could go to the bar or the coffee shop and have your interesting philosophical debates about like death and whether brain death was really death, but that just was sort of like not taken seriously. And now we have really like a serious questioning and almost like returning back to like intense philosophical debate about death and the definition of death. So I do think it's important that we don't get too kind of content in bioethics. We need to keep taking big swings at ourselves and kind of going to philosophy for some of those big swings, and not just kind of be complacent that everything has been settled and we've figured everything out.
There's a question here. Following grad school, how do you suggest we bring philosophers and clinical ethicists together more to talk about these interesting concepts that might contribute to both fields?
I think workshops and conferences are great, but those things take money to organize. So I would say just be local and organic. So what I do, for example, is down here in Houston, Texas, I run a couple of like works in progress groups and reading groups that meet monthly. And I've just collected all the people that are in my vicinity who I think are philosophers who have some interest in bioethics. And they often will initially say, oh, I don't do bioethics. I don't have interest in bioethics. And I sort of say, yes, like broadly construed, if you have interest in ethical theory or like normative ethics, like I want you to be part of this group because I think that's relevant to bioethics. And again, it's relevant to like the big swings, like take some big swings at things that we take for granted. And then go over to the hospital and find who are the clinical ethicists, who are the postdocs, the fellows, and bring those people all together. It's just like finding those people, bring them together for a monthly works in progress group or a monthly reading group or something like that. And I think I've just found those sorts of things incredibly fruitful. And I think the other members have as well. We all learn so much from each other.
So to wrap up, I have a few plugs to make. One is that you run, is it philosophicalbioethics.org or .com?
.com, yep.
Okay, which is a great resource. There's a lot of different stuff on there, and it's great to see kind of a place to go where philosophical bioethics is happening. Andrew has just posted Jenny's the link to that, and then Jenny's website. I have a philosophical bioethics workshop coming up at the University of Toronto, May 17th and 18th. It's free. It's on the downtown campus. And Andrew has also posted my website and then my Substack, where I write about assisted dying and other bioethics concepts for a non-philosopher audience. So thank you, Jenny, so much for this. This was great. And I'll turn it back over to Zach.
Well, thank you both for such an engaging conversation. And yeah, thank you to everyone who joined. And if you enjoyed this, come to the next conversation series. And thank you all so much.
Thanks.